A routine day, a young man walking through the city. Suddenly, sirens, flashing lights. An officer grabs his arm. The cold steel of handcuffs snaps around his wrists. He is confused. He is scared. He is innocent. But the cop does not know. His mother is a judge. And soon, the entire courtroom will be in shock. The city bustled with its usual noise, a steady hum of honking cars, the murmur of voices, and the rhythmic tap of shoes on the sidewalk. The sun hung high, its light reflecting off the glass of the nearby skyscrapers. It was a typical afternoon in the urban sprawl, a city that never seemed to slow down. People moved about with purpose, their heads down or their eyes lost in thought, absorbed in their routines. The sounds of the city blended together, creating a backdrop for the lives of those walking through it. Among them was Jamal Carter, a young black teenager, his earbuds securely in place as he strolled down the sidewalk. He was dressed casually, a gray sweater over a black shirt, his jeans fitting just right, his sneakers scuffing softly against the concrete. His mind was elsewhere, the world around him a blur. He was lost in his own music, headphones blocking out the cacophony of the city. He had no idea that, within the next few moments, everything in his life would be flipped upside down. From a distance, the sound of an approaching siren sliced through the air, but Jamal, lost in the beat of his music, didn't notice. He continued walking, unaware that he was being watched. That was until a sharp hand clamped down on his arm. The force of the grip made his body jerk to a halt, his head snapping up in confusion. The music that had once enveloped him was now drowned out by the harsh reality of the situation. A voice, low and authoritative, cut through his shock. "You match the description of a suspect. Put your hands behind your back." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The world around him seemed to slow as his body froze in disbelief. He had no idea what was going on, no idea why this officer had grabbed him. His breath hitched as he tried to make sense of the situation, his mind racing. "What? I didn't do anything." His voice cracked, a mixture of fear and confusion pooling in his chest. The officer didn't respond, his grip on Jamal's arm tightening as he pulled the teen's wrists behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around Jamal's wrists with an unnerving finality. Jamal tried to pull away, but the officer's strength overpowered him. He felt the weight of the cuffs dragging him down, his body tense with the rising panic that clenched at his throat. The crowd that had gathered around them began to murmur, their voices rising as they watched the scene unfold. People pulled out their phones, their fingers moving rapidly as they began recording, capturing the moment. Some whispered under their breath, questioning what had just happened, while others exchanged skeptical glances. "What did he do?" one person murmured. "I don't know," someone else responded. "Looks like they just took him." Some shook their heads, clearly unsure of the situation, others clearly displeased with what they saw. Jamal's mind raced. He wasn't some criminal. He was just a teenager walking down the street minding his own business. His thoughts scrambled to make sense of why this was happening. What did he match the description of? He glanced around the crowd, desperate for a familiar face, for someone who could help him. But all he saw were strangers, staring with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. He opened his mouth to protest again, but the officer's grip on his arm didn't loosen. Amidst the growing whispers, one woman in the crowd watched intently. Her face was unreadable, her eyes fixed on the scene with a quiet, unwavering focus. She stood apart from the others, her posture calm but tense, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was dressed in a sharp, professional suit, an older woman, maybe in her late 40s, but there was something about her demeanor that seemed to separate her from the onlookers. She didn't speak, didn't move, but her eyes never left Jamal. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Jamal's confusion deepened. He didn't recognize her, but something about the way she looked at him gave him an odd sense of reassurance. It was as if she knew more than anyone else, as if she understood what was really going on. For a fleeting second, he felt as though she might be the only one who could help him. But then, just as quickly, she turned her attention back to the officer and the unfolding scene. Jamal's pulse hammered in his ears as Officer Daniels, mid-40s, muscular, with a firm and professional expression, began speaking to him in clipped, emotionless tones. "You'll have a chance to explain yourself at the station," the officer said, his voice steady. The words felt like a slap to Jamal's face, the finality of them crushing any hope of a quick resolution. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be over quickly. As the crowd continued to watch and record, Jamal was led away, his steps slow and uncertain, his body stiff with the weight of the cuffs. His mind was clouded with confusion and fear, but somewhere deep down, he knew this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. There was something much bigger at play here, a chain of events that would soon unfold, and Jamal would soon realize that the woman watching him had a far more significant role in this story than he could possibly know. Jamal Carter had always been a young man with a plan. Ambitious and driven, he'd never let anything or anyone deter him from his goals. Raised by his mother, Judge Vanessa Carter, Jamal had grown up with an unwavering sense of responsibility. His mother had set the bar high for him, teaching him the value of hard work, integrity, and respect. He was an honor student at his high school, with dreams of earning a basketball scholarship to a major college. But most importantly, Jamal had always felt a deep sense of pride in his family. His mother, Judge Vanessa Carter, was one of the most respected figures in the city's legal system. Known for her fierce commitment to justice and fairness, Judge Carter had become an inspiration not only to her colleagues but to the community as a whole. Growing up with such a strong, influential figure in his life had shaped Jamal into the young man he was today. He'd never gotten into trouble, never been arrested. Jamal was the kind of kid who stayed out of the way, focused on his education, his sports, and the future that lay ahead of him. Today, as Jamal walked through the busy streets of the city, everything felt normal. It was just another day. He had finished his morning classes at school, a practice session with the basketball team, and now he was on his way to meet a friend at a local cafe. A quick chat, maybe some coffee, nothing more than a simple, routine day. Jamal had been looking forward to some downtime, to just relax and unwind before the day's responsibilities kicked back in. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Earlier that morning, a robbery had been reported in the area. A young man, described vaguely by witnesses as wearing a gray hoodie and being around Jamal's age, had stolen a woman's purse. The details were slim, just enough to set off a chain of events. A few hours later, Jamal, walking down the very same street, was unknowingly about to match that description. He was dressed in his usual attire, gray hoodie, black jeans, sneakers, and the description from the robbery report couldn't have been more general. It wasn't a description of a specific person, but Jamal had the unfortunate misfortune of fitting it perfectly. The color of his hoodie, the fact that he was a young black male, those simple factors, combined with the fact that he was in the same area, would be enough to set suspicion in motion. As Jamal walked along the street, lost in his thoughts about his upcoming meeting with his friend, he was completely unaware that someone had already noticed him. The sound of footsteps approaching quickly grew louder behind him, but it wasn't until he felt a sharp grip on his arm that he realized something was wrong. His body froze as a voice, firm and commanding, ordered, "You match the description of a suspect. Put your hands behind your back." Jamal's heart skipped a beat, his eyes wide with shock. His mind couldn't process what was happening. "What? I didn't do anything," he protested, his voice shaky with confusion. His confusion turned to fear as he felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around his wrists, tightening painfully with every passing second. He had never imagined that his life would take such a turn. He wasn't just a teenager walking down the street. He was a teenager, an innocent one, caught in the crosshairs of a system that didn't care to listen to his side of the story. His first instinct was to resist, to shout and demand answers, but the officer wasn't listening. Officer Daniels, mid-40s, muscular and unwavering, was doing his job. He had been told to apprehend someone who fit the description of the suspect in the robbery, and in his mind, Jamal was the one. The sounds of the city, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, faded into a dull hum as Jamal was dragged to the side of the sidewalk. The world seemed to close in on him. What was going on? Why him? Why now? The crowd began to gather quickly, whispers rising as people started to pull out their phones to record. The murmurs of bystanders floated in the air as some pulled back, watching the unfolding scene in disbelief, while others exchanged opinions under their breath. "What did he do?" someone asked, peering over the crowd, their voice heavy with skepticism. "I don't know. It seems like a mistake," another person replied, unsure. Jamal's pulse hammered in his ears. His heart was still racing from the shock, but his thoughts were moving even faster. His mind kept replaying his mother's teachings. Always tell the truth. Stand up for what's right. Be proud of who you are. But none of that mattered right now. He was just another young black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The description had been vague. His hoodie was gray. He was young. He was black. That was enough to paint him as a suspect in the eyes of Officer Daniels. And despite the fact that Jamal had nothing to do with the crime, despite the fact that he had always been a law-abiding citizen, this moment, this single interaction, was about to change everything for him. As the officer began speaking to him in a tone that was professional but distant, Jamal's mind raced. The uncertainty, the fear, the feeling of helplessness swelled inside him. His life had just been flipped upside down. He was innocent, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the officer's firm grip, the cold steel of the handcuffs, and the fact that Jamal's name was now tangled up in something far bigger than a simple misunderstanding. In that moment, Jamal had no idea how much his life was about to change, how his mother's influence, her years of work, her reputation, would soon play a part in uncovering the truth. The courtroom would soon be in shock, but Jamal wasn't there yet. He was just a young man with his whole life ahead of him, trying to understand why this was happening, trying to figure out how to prove his innocence. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, the panic rising with every step as Officer Daniels shoved him toward the squad car. His mind was racing, his thoughts scattered in the confusion and fear. He couldn't breathe. His body felt heavy, like he was being dragged through a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. This wasn't real. How could it be? He hadn't done anything wrong. Why was this happening to him? "You've got the wrong guy. Check my ID. Call my mom." Jamal pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation. He tried to twist his body away from the officer, but Daniel's grip tightened, his hand cuffed securely behind Jamal's back. The metal cut into his skin, and every movement seemed to make it worse. He couldn't get away, couldn't even find the words to make it stop. The officer's response was as cold as the cuffs around Jamal's wrists. "You can explain yourself at the station," he said with a dismissive tone, not even looking at Jamal as he continued pushing the teenager toward the waiting squad car. Jamal's voice grew more frantic. "Please, you don't understand. My mom is Judge Vanessa Carter. You can't do this. You don't know who I am." His words were met with silence. He could feel the eyes of the onlookers on him, but they didn't help. They didn't stop the officer. His words hung in the air, useless, like they didn't matter. The crowd continued to grow around them, whispers turning into murmurs, questions and judgments tossed back and forth like a game. Jamal tried to make eye contact with anyone who might offer help, but the faces around him were a blur of confusion and uncertainty. That was when the woman in the crowd, the one who had been watching intently from the beginning, stepped forward. She moved with a quiet, unwavering confidence, a stillness in the midst of the chaos. Her presence felt like a calm breeze in a storm, steady and unshaken. Jamal barely registered who she was at first, his mind still whirling with disbelief until she spoke. "Officer, do you know who I am?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a knowing strength that cut through the tension surrounding them. Officer Daniels barely spared her a glance, his eyes focused on the task at hand. "Ma'am, step back. This does not concern you," he muttered, his voice dismissive as he continued to lead Jamal toward the squad car. But the crowd had started to take notice. The murmurs grew louder as people recognized the woman's face. Some whispered her name. "That's Judge Vanessa Carter. She's the judge who's been making waves in the courtroom." The realization rippled through the crowd, and Jamal's heart skipped in his chest. His mother was here. Jamal's emotions crashed together in a chaotic mix, relief, confusion, and a rising anger that felt like it might explode. "Mom, please help me," he thought, as he tried to turn his head, catching a glimpse of his mother's expression. There was no panic in her face, no anger, just a calmness that he had always admired in her. But even now, standing in front of him, with everything happening in that moment, her expression didn't change. The camera zoomed in on Jamal's face as he stood there, handcuffed and helpless, his anger, fear, and confusion all clashing together in one overwhelming storm. His eyes widened, the emotions swirling in his chest, threatening to break free. His mind screamed for answers, but all he could do was stand there, caught in the moment, unable to change what was happening to him. "Where are you watching from? What time is it in your area?" The narrator's voice suddenly cut through, adding to the already mounting tension. "Imagine if this happened in your city. What would you do?" Jamal's eyes flicked toward the officer as he opened the squad car door, ready to shove him inside. His body trembled with the weight of what was happening, the cuffs digging deeper into his wrists as he was pushed into the back seat of the car. But the worst part was that nothing had been explained. There had been no questions, no attempts to understand. No one had listened to him. Jamal tried again, this time his voice low, more defeated than before. "Please, I didn't do anything. I'm innocent, please." But it didn't matter. The officer closed the door with a sharp click. And just like that, Jamal was alone in the back of the squad car. The world outside blurred through the tinted windows, the crowd now a distant hum. His mother wasn't arguing. She wasn't raising her voice or demanding that he be let go. Instead, she stood still, watching him being driven away. She pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up as she began typing something. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't frantic. She was documenting. She knew what was coming next. She knew that this moment was just the beginning. And Jamal, confused and scared, could do nothing but watch as the city faded into the distance, his future uncertain, his innocence ignored, and his world about to be turned upside down. Jamal sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, his hands still raw from the cuffs that had been too tight, his body tense with both fear and frustration. He couldn't understand why this was happening to him. His heart pounded relentlessly in his chest, the thumping of his pulse drowning out everything else. He had been trying to remain calm, telling himself over and over that someone would figure out the truth, that this would all be cleared up. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, he began to doubt whether anyone would believe him. Would they hear him out? Or would his fate be sealed because of the color of his hoodie, the assumptions made about him, the way he looked? The officers outside the room were speaking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible through the thick door. Jamal couldn't make out their words, but he could tell by the urgency in their murmurs that they were scrambling to find something, anything, to confirm why he was here. He knew he was innocent. He'd done nothing wrong, nothing at all. But it seemed like no one cared to listen to him. He was just another young black man in handcuffs, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. His thoughts began to spiral, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. What if they don't believe me? What if they don't care? The door suddenly swung open with a loud creak that startled Jamal. His eyes shot up, the instant relief that surged through him quickly replaced with a deep sense of awe and recognition. Standing in the doorway was his mother, Judge Vanessa Carter. Her presence filled the room in a way that nothing else could. She wasn't there as his mother, not in that moment. She was a judge, a legal force, and the sharpness in her eyes was enough to make even the toughest officer pause. She wasn't here for a family hug or comforting words. No, she was here for something far bigger. Justice. "Release him," Judge Carter commanded, her voice unwavering, filled with the authority that only a respected judge could wield. There was no hesitation in her tone, no sign of uncertainty. Her words rang through the room with the same weight they carried in her courtroom. Officer Daniels, the officer who had arrested Jamal, looked at her in confusion, clearly flustered by her sudden arrival. "Ma'am, we are handling this by protocol," he stammered, his voice unsteady, as if trying to justify his actions, even though he knew they were wrong. Judge Carter wasn't having it. She cut him off before he could finish. "You just falsely arrested a sitting judge's son without probable cause. You should pray this does not end your career." The words were sharp, slicing through the tension in the room. Jamal watched as Officer Daniels blinked in disbelief, unsure of how to respond. His superior, still standing in the doorway, glanced between his subordinate and the judge, his face pale as the realization settled in. He had made a mistake that could end much more than just an arrest. His career, his integrity, and his position in the department could all be on the line now. The officer stood silent, the weight of the accusation sinking in, while the murmurs of his colleagues outside grew louder. Judge Carter remained unmoved, her stance firm and resolute as she stepped further into the room. She was no longer just his mother. She was the embodiment of the law, standing tall against the system that had wronged her son. Jamal's heart calmed slightly as he looked at her, the relief washing over him in waves. She was here, and she wasn't backing down. But even as he felt the smallest inkling of hope, his mind raced. How much damage had already been done? What would it take to undo this? His freedom? His dignity? Or was it all a lost cause, overshadowed by the easy assumptions made about him? The officers outside scrambled to gather evidence, their voices rising with urgency as they attempted to piece together the situation. As the tension in the room thickened, a new wave of information flooded in. The security footage had just been reviewed. The real suspect was across town when Jamal had been arrested. It was almost too simple. The moment the footage came through, everything Jamal had said became undeniable. The officer's face turned a shade paler as the realization hit. He wasn't the person they were looking for. Jamal had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he hadn't been the criminal. The truth was clear now. There was no evidence to support the arrest, no reason for Jamal to have been detained. The search for a suspect had led to the wrong conclusion, and now the officers had to face the consequences of their rushed decisions. Jamal felt the shift in the air as the officers began to shuffle, muttering to each other, their faces a mix of frustration and embarrassment. Their confidence was shattered, and the reality of their mistake was settling in. Officer Daniels, still in disbelief, turned to his superior, but words failed him. The superior officer, clearly rattled by the events, nodded sharply. "Get him out of here," the superior officer commanded, his voice strained. "This case is closed." The cuffs were finally removed from Jamal's wrists, and the officer stepped back, his actions suddenly tentative as he realized the weight of what had just transpired. Jamal stood up, his body aching from the tension and fear. But there was an overwhelming sense of gratitude for his mother that made everything feel more bearable. She had fought for him. She had made sure the truth came to light. "Let's go home, Jamal," Judge Carter said softly, her voice now tender, but still carrying the force of a woman who had just delivered a powerful message. Jamal didn't say anything as they walked out of the interrogation room together. The officers who had once stood tall now looked down, their faces marked by the embarrassment of their. The case was over, but Jamal's sense of justice was just beginning. The courthouse steps were a flurry of activity, a sea of flashing cameras and reporters shouting questions into the air. Jamal Carter and his mother, Judge Vanessa Carter, walked side by side, their faces stoic but their presence undeniable. The crowd parted to make way for them, eyes following their every move, a mix of curiosity and admiration in the air. Jamal, now dressed in a formal suit, stood tall next to his mother, his posture strong, though the weight of the ordeal still lingered in his eyes. The sound of clicking cameras filled the space, but it was Judge Carter's calm, measured voice that cut through the noise. "My son was lucky," she began, her tone unwavering. "But how many innocent young men do not have a judge for a mother?" The reporters fell silent for a moment as if her words had struck a chord with each of them. The reality of the situation sank in. The fortunate few like Jamal had someone to stand up for them, someone who could use the power of the law to ensure their rights were respected. But for so many others, there was no one to speak for them, no one to fight for their innocence when the system turned a blind eye based on nothing more than assumptions and racial profiling. As they moved toward the car waiting for them, Jamal couldn't help but glance over at the reporters, their pens poised, waiting for more words from his mother. He had survived the storm, but the scars would take longer to heal. The ordeal had left him feeling both stronger and more vulnerable than ever before. he was free now, but many others wouldn't be so lucky. Behind them, the scene shifted to the police department. Officer Daniels, the man who had arrested Jamal, was walking out of the courthouse, his uniform neat, but his shoulders slumped. His once confident stride was now slower, hesitant, and his eyes were downcast as if weighed by an unseen burden. The public scrutiny was thick. His actions had been questioned, and the consequences of his rash decision were just beginning to unfold. The once sturdy foundation of his career now seemed fragile, and in the quiet of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the end of it all? Jamal, standing with his mother by his side, couldn't look back at Officer Daniels. His focus was on the future, the life ahead of him. He had been falsely accused, dragged through a system that was supposed to protect him, but now he was free, and in that freedom was a lesson, one he would carry with him always. Jamal Carter was innocent. The narrator's voice filled the screen, but his skin color made him guilty in the eyes of those who judged first and asked later. How many more Jamals are out there? The question lingered in the air, an unsettling reminder of the systemic issues that continued to plague the justice system. The screen slowly faded to black, the ticking of a courtroom clock echoing in the background. Each second seemed to stretch, as if reminding the audience that justice was not always as clear-cut as it seemed. It wasn't always about the facts. It wasn't always about the truth. Sometimes it was about who had the power to speak, and who was silenced before they even had a chance to be heard. The narrator's voice returned, softer now, almost as if it were asking a question for the viewer to ponder, as the screen faded completely. What time is it where you are? And do you think justice was truly served? Let us know below. The camera lingered on the empty courthouse steps, the quiet aftermath of a battle won, but a war that was far from over. Justice had been served for Jamal, but the question remained, how many others would have the same chance?